This is the Living Vertizontal Podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. We are a podcast that discusses the intersection of Scripture and our lives. Together, we continue the conversation that was started each preceding Sunday morning in our worship gathering.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
And I'm Natasha.
And we are the Living Vertizontal Podcast with you this week to continue our journey through the Gospel of Luke. As a quick reminder, last week we moved into Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 11, where we looked into two different interactions regarding the Sabbath. Together, we discussed what Sabbath is and how rather than Sabbath being something that must be protected by a series of laws, it is an invitation to grow in dependence on Jesus for each and every single word and action. When we live this way, rather than relying on rules to walk with Him, to walk with Jesus, we rely on our relationship, a relationship that calls us into action within His kingdom on a regular basis. This week, we continue on in Luke chapter 6 with verses 12 through 26. In these verses, we read of Jesus' calling of the 12, healing the multitudes, and the Beatitudes. Natasha is going to be reading this passage for us. So, Natasha, would you read Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 26?
Yes. Luke chapter 6, verse 12. In those days, Jesus went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. When daylight came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated as apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Then Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place. A large crowd of his disciples was there, along with a great number of people from all over Judea, Jerusalem, and the sea coast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those troubled by unclean spirits were healed. The entire crowd was trying to touch him, because power was coming from him and healing them all. Looking up at his disciples, Jesus said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven, for their fathers treated the prophets in the same way. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will hunger. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for their fathers treated the false prophets in the same way."
Thank you for reading that for us today, Natasha. As we move into this conversation on these different pieces of our passage today, I think the first thing that I would like to just identify, another, context statement, as I started the show with last week as well, is it seems as though there's like another scene type of change. 2 weeks ago, we had the 2 weeks that we spent in Levi's house or in that area, in this celebration that happened. And then last week we had this scene change where it talked about two different Sabbaths that Jesus was operating on. And then here it doesn't say, it's not like this continuation of on one of those Sabbath days. It does say in those days, but it's almost like at that time as well, somewhere in that time, not necessarily on that same exact moment. In those days, Jesus went out to the mountain to pray. So kind of like a scene change, but at the same time also the words that Luke chooses to use here essentially seem like they establish a routine that Jesus had in his life. And so as we move into this passage as we move into this conversation, that's kind of what's going to set the tone for what comes.
Well, yeah. And I think that where this passage starts this week is just, I think, such an important reminder. It's of the importance of our dependence on God. The verse 12, it just begins right from the start. In those days, Jesus went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. And it's as if before Jesus did anything,
yep,
and we know this to be true, he established his need for his Father and for his dependence on him to do anything, to say anything, to make any decision. Anything comes from time spent with his Father in prayer. And this is the model that Jesus set for his disciples. It's the model he sets for us. And I think it's worth definitely spending some time here discussing the implications of this verse.
Yeah. So this week in our midweek meditations, one of the first questions actually draws attention to this and talks, references John chapter 5, verse 19, where it says Jesus, and the verse is, does nothing by himself, for whatever the Father does, the Son also does. And so this statement that Jesus only ever acts or speaks in a way that he sees his Father acting or hears his Father speaking. And the first statement I want to make about this is, and I think we've said it before, but just in case, saying that Jesus does nothing by himself isn't a statement on what he is able to do.
Right.
It is a statement on what he is choosing to do.
Yes.
As we talked about back when we talked about Jesus's temptations in the wilderness, right? Like this time in the wilderness set in stone, kind of laid this foundation of Jesus's dependence on his Father and his choice to depend on his Father, because even in the wilderness, he could have chosen to do something different. He could have chosen to turn the rock into bread. He could have chosen to draw attention to himself by jumping off of the temple and not dying. He could have chosen to bow down and automatically assume all of the kingdoms of the world under his influence. But he didn't, because it's not about him. It's not about him being in charge. It's about him submitting to and being dependent on his Father. And so when we look at this passage in Luke paired with this statement from John about the Son doing nothing apart from the Father, we're not talking about the inability to operate. It's not that Jesus is unable to do things without this time. It's that he is choosing not to do things without this time. Right. Which I think is very important for us.
It's a good distinction to make.
Yeah. And then the second thing that I would want to say about this, I already kind of made an initial statement in the opening, but is just the fact that this verse 12 essentially seems to be establishing this routine that Jesus had. So this isn't just this one particular moment where something like this happened, but this is Jesus's mode of operation. This is how he functions. We've been reading of things that he has done and like interactions that he has shared with the Pharisees. And here we get this snapshot that reminds us, right? Because it's been a little bit now since we had the conversation of Jesus's like dependence on God in the wilderness. But now it's almost like Luke is reminding the reader and those around him again of Jesus is dependent on his Father for everything that he does. He does not do something but for following him. And so this is just always how he is. It's not like this is a unique moment in time for Jesus to be going and talking to Jesus because he has this important decision to make about who his followers are going to be. No, this is just what he did. In those days, he did what he always did, which was spent his time with his Father.
And I think this is so important because we know that Jesus is our standard. He's our model.
Yep.
And so if Jesus never did or said anything apart from his Father, and this is a lifestyle that he lived, then if we're going to be his followers, then it follows that we should be doing and saying nothing independent of him. And that requires, just as it required of Jesus, to be in constant dialogue with his Father, to set aside concentrated time for interaction with his Father. It requires us to set aside intentional time to be in regular interaction with our Father, but not just doing it and in a concentrated time. I'm assuming that Jesus took this interaction with him, and that this interaction was ongoing, and certainly should be for us as we have the Holy Spirit and we get to live in the presence of God as we go about our mission. We should be in constant dialogue and allowing him to inform everything we do and say. And I think this is at the heart of what it really means to be a follower of Jesus.
Yeah. And, I know we're talking about Luke, but I think this conversation reaches into many different parts of Scripture. And one of the things that immediately came to mind with what you were just saying about how this, Jesus is our model, Jesus is our standard, like this is the way we ought to live as well. In 1 John 2:6, John, one of his disciples, makes this statement that says, those who say they live in God should live their lives as Jesus did. And there's a lot of things that we can say that Jesus did I would say are more like fruit-based, where it's the result of things. But I think at the foundation, like I said earlier, the foundation of everything Jesus did was live in this dependent relationship with his Father. And so if we, as Christians, are to live like Jesus lived, sure, we should be...
the fruit should look like his.
Sure, yeah, sure, the fruit should look like his, but the foundation has to first be there, which is this dependence that we have, where we move slow enough through life to focus on Jesus enough, to listen to him enough, that we don't run ahead with our words, that we don't run ahead with our thoughts, that we don't run ahead with our actions, but we only do what we see him doing, and we only say what we hear him saying.
And really, enough is every moment, because if we miss a moment,
yep,
we think we get it, and we misinterpret so often what he's trying to do, because what he does is so incredibly miraculous and unexpected. It's difficult for us to anticipate his next move. And so because of that, we need a moment by moment leadership, like planning session with Jesus in order to carry out his intended will for our lives, for kingdom building. Yeah.
Yeah. And so jumping back into our passage, this is what Jesus did. He spent the night in prayer to God. And when I was working through the midweek meditations, I initially was like, okay, so he spent the night praying about, okay, God, who am I supposed to name as my disciples? Because that's the next thing that happens, right? The next event is the choosing of the 12. But then I kind of got checked when I was thinking that way, because it assumes that Jesus went into this conversation with the expectation of what he was already going to do, and then he was just asking God how to do it. But I would imagine he went into this conversation fully dependent on him. So it was really probably something like just praying for those who were following him. And then out of this conversation
of what does it look like to shepherd this massive group of followers that I've acquired?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very, very possible. Jesus is like, so what's the next step? God, what's the next step, Father? And God says, you're going to pick out some. You're going to pick some of them. So not only is Jesus, in my mind, I guess the eyes that were opened was, not only is Jesus going to his Father to figure out which 12 he should pick, but he was going to his Father to even know that he should pick 12. Mm-hmm. And then who those 12 were. It goes to show, again, to reiterate this idea of just how dependent Jesus was, and just how slow he was to operate. And it also exposes my own thought process, right? Because my thought is, well, Jesus is going to pick 12, so he just went and prayed and said, okay, who are the 12 I should pick? But that assumed that Jesus already was just operating in some of his own thoughts. And so we got to slow down even more as Jesus slowed down.
Yeah.
And I think for me, like, as I bring this into my own life, I don't know. We have talked so much on this podcast and so much within like the small groups for our church in our midweek times, the encounter group, and so much on Sunday mornings. We've talked so much about the importance of slowing down. We have talked so much about like holding every thought captive and needing to, walk slowly with Jesus. And yet even still, I find myself regularly like operating on at some level on assumptions or on what I would call maybe an autopilot, where it's like I have my own preconceived understanding of how to do something or what I should do in the next step of the process of whatever it is. And so I'm just kind of on this autopilot
instead of remaining dependent
in literally everything. And the call is to remain dependent in everything.
Right.
Not just in those things that autopilot doesn't function so well in, but in everything.
A lot of times in the church, we talk about having and establishing disciplines. And I don't think listening to Jesus in this way is necessarily one of the disciplines we talk about too much. We talk about the discipline of reading your Bible. We do talk about the discipline of prayer, but we don't talk about what the discipline of continual prayer looks like. And we definitely don't do a good job of practicing that, I think, in the church. And so this feels foreign. It feels difficult because it feels, it's not something that we're regularly accustomed to doing. But if we're going to call ourselves followers of Jesus and we're going to do as Jesus did, then we're going to have to remain in this dependent state moment by moment for every single decision, every word we say, every action we perform. It has to be from him.
Yeah. And so, that, again, jumping back into our story, this is what Jesus does. And as a result of Jesus doing this, there's 12 people that he's directed to pick out of the disciples that were following him at that time, which maybe even exposing my ignorance again, like, well, Jesus just had 12 disciples. No, he had, according to this part, numerous disciples. And from those, there was 12 that were chosen. It's not like he just was walking along and would randomly pluck out 12. There was 12 from among these that were already following him that were kind of set aside for a purpose. And that purpose, according to verse 13, it says that he also designated them as apostles. And so that kind of establishes what the purpose is, because when you go back into the Greek, and I'm probably going to butcher the word, but apostle or apostolos meant one who is sent or messenger. And so in selecting these 12 individuals, he was also establishing their purpose going forward of what they were going to be doing, why he had selected them. He was selecting them to be sent. He not necessarily selecting them because they were, quote, set apart for, like, all of a sudden they're like the super Christians, right? No, they're just the ones that he's going to be pouring into over these next couple of years while he's with them, and tasking them with continuing what he has started, because they are going to be the sent ones.
And then we have this presentation of all of those who are going to be sent, all those designated as the apostles. And when you look at this list and you spend some time kind of digging into each of the various apostles that he appointed, you start to realize that there is a spectrum here.
Yeah.
These individuals, they come from a variety of backgrounds, a variety of occupations, a variety of training, a variety of it couldn't be more opposite in some cases. And it's it's a remarkable conglomerate, I guess, that Jesus has put together here.
Yeah, one of those remarkable opposites that got my attention, again, as we were working through the midweek meditations, we had this table that we could, with all the names and just things that we know about them, and writing them down. And one of them that really stuck out to me was Matthew or Levi and Simon called the Zealot. And so these are two very, like, I guess, popular names in the sense of, like, you quickly identify those names as a disciple, a member of the 12. But the thing that really got me was as I was looking at what these were, and I guess I have become so familiar with this term zealot that I almost was no longer recognizing what it meant.
You're not thinking about the implications of
Yes.
what having these people together means.
Right. So you have Levi, who is essentially an agent of Rome. He's a Jew, like we talked about.
But he's a traitor Jew.
And he works for Rome. He is a representative of the Roman government. Okay? Mm-hmm. And then you have Simon the Zealot. And zealots, they were a sect of Jews who desired nothing more than to eliminate the Roman government and those who represented the Roman government. In other words, these are like the worst enemies you could possibly imagine. And Jesus is pulling them together.
Politically, they're polar opposites.
Practically, they're polar opposites. Like the way they live their life on a daily basis, their focus in life, like they're just different, very different. Mm-hmm. And to try to put them in the same space, to even think that it's a good idea.
Right. You would not sit these guys together at a wedding or anything like that. Yeah.
You shouldn't even invite them to the same wedding. Like, that's just not a good idea. Because Simon's like purpose in life to this point would essentially be to eliminate people like Matthew. And Matthew's like purpose in this life would essentially just be to care about himself and get rich off of the people around him, like Simon.
While serving
Simon's arch enemy.
Yeah.
And so when I was thinking about this, like I was like, okay, so how can I best understand what this would be like? And I came up with some thoughts, like some really easy ones where it's like, oh, it would be like Jesus today calling an Israeli soldier and a Palestinian soldier. And then I was like, okay, but that's really far removed from us. Like I don't actually grasp the animosity and the tension that exists like between them. So then I was like, oh, well, another low-hanging fruit, it would be like calling a Ukrainian soldier and maybe a Russian soldier. And then I was like, no, again, that's still like too far removed. Like I can't fully grasp the tension that may exist between those two people. So then I was like, okay, like what's going on in our country? Where do we have factions that exist? And I started to think like, in the recent past, it would be maybe like Jesus calling a leader of the Black Lives Matter movement and a police chief to follow him and expecting them to work together. I imagine there would be a lot of tension there. Or to bring it into like current events, it would be like Jesus calling an ICE agent and the family member of a recently deported undocumented resident. Like, there is so much tension. All you got to do is turn on the news. You can see the tension. It's palatable. It's all over people's posts. It's all over social media like crazy. And there's just so much tension that exists here in this conversation. But this is exactly like the conversation that would be being had between a zealot and a tax collector. And yet Jesus thought it was a good idea to call them together, giving them a different purpose, calling them to a different purpose, calling them to a different focus. And I just think it's incredible. Like you said, like this, all these names, there's just this wide gamut. And it really is. I feel like it's, in a way, summed up in those two people. Like, as far as you can imagine the differences that exist, and yet Jesus brings them together for something greater.
As we're sitting here talking about the great differences between these two apostles and how Jesus, as a purpose, was able to unify them, it's not lost, or I feel like it shouldn't be lost, that's this is the thing, right? Jesus has purpose and he gives purpose, and his purpose is so much bigger than all of these differences. And really, like Jesus, if he desire, we know he desires to reconcile creation. We know he desires for peace on earth. And so if that's his purpose, then us aligning ourselves with him and being dependent on him for everything we do, eventually, how could it not bring polarized enemies, assuming that they're both in pursuit of dependence on him? How could it not bring polarized enemies into unity?
Right.
It absolutely should, and it absolutely would.
Yep.
And I mean, I know we talk about how Jesus is the answer and Jesus will solve all the problems, but really unifying around this purpose of ushering in his perfect kingdom, creation as it was intended. That has the power to overcome all differences. And perhaps their inclusion in this group is so that people then and people today can see that, can be reminded of this bigger purpose that can overcome all the nuances of differences as we each lay our specifics that aren't him aside, and he unifies us.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, though, today when we make that statement like Jesus is the answer, I feel like far too often what that means, or what maybe is understood when we say Jesus is the answer, is like people need to know about Jesus. Like if you just know about Jesus, then it'll fix everything. But what we're talking about, what the disciples experienced with Jesus, what Jesus experienced in those days going to the mountain to pray, was more than just knowing about something. It was actually knowing someone. And so when we say Jesus is the answer, we're not saying as long as you can, quote a bunch of Bible verses, or as long as you can, say something about this person, then it's going to take care of these situations. No, we're saying like Jesus in relationship with him. That's the answer. That's the solution.
And more than just even knowing him. It's also choosing, as Jesus chose, to be dependent on him and to choose his way every time in every situation, even when we personally don't feel like it.
Right. Yep.
Even when we personally don't see how that's going to bring any greater good. But I mean, trusting that his way will ultimately bring the good and perfect. And so being obedient in hope that our obedience and our dependence will eventually lead to that.
And as we move on in this passage and we look at Jesus healing the multitudes, you see this played out. You see the just how infectious Jesus's way of living and the like existing with him. You see how infectious that is. Like when you work through verses 17 through 19, you see this list that exists. So a large crowd of his disciples was there, along with a great number of people from all over Judea, Jerusalem, so that's kind of one area, and the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon. And we already know that there's a whole bunch of people around there from Galilee because that's the setting of where we have been. And so if you were to look at a map, if you were to understand what these lists of locations mean, you have the religious/political center of Israel listed and everything that represents.
In Judea and Jerusalem.
You have kind of the fringes of Israel represented by Galilee.
The less religious folk.
I mean, they grew up further from the religious center. And so it's not necessarily like inundated into their daily lives. Like they're still very devout. There's still the ability to be very devout to their faith and to their tradition and to their religion, but it was less like prevalent, if that makes sense. And then you have Tyre and Sidon. That is not just the edge of Jewish society, but beyond that, because now we're talking about Gentile society. We're talking about people who, pagans, people who are maybe even passionate about other religions. And yet all of these people are coming together. And what is bringing all of these people together? Jesus, period. And the way that he is living. And again, our passage today starts with a statement that Jesus was rooted in his Father, right? Nothing that we have talked about so far happens until after Jesus has spent this time with his Father. Praying.
As Jesus is
as Jesus is spending time with his Father. And then you have the choosing of the 12, and then you have a crowd of people gathered around him, trying to touch him because power was coming from him and healing them all. Jesus is bringing these people together from the far edges of different societies, of societies that would never come together. Of society, like, remember the Pharisees having a problem with Jesus and his disciples being around the tax collectors. They didn't just have animosity for tax collectors. Like, you also shouldn't be eating with Gentiles. You shouldn't be hanging around Gentiles. You should be avoiding them because they could make you ceremonially unclean. And yet, people from the religious center are coming together with people from Tyre and Sidon, people they shouldn't be coming together with. Because rather than being focused on the differences that set them apart and the reason why they should never come together, they're focused on Jesus, who is bringing them together.
And in unifying them around a common purpose. And I think, that's probably largely Luke's intent of including all of these statements right here, right next to each other. He's talking about and introducing this new kingdom that Jesus is bringing in. And so the next question is, well, who's it for? Well, it seems like who it's for is kind of limitless.
Yep.
It's for everyone. And it's not just to be inclusive of everyone. Like, it's not just to include everyone, but it's also to unify everyone. Which is, I can't imagine how this must have rocked the perspective of the prevailing, the prevailing Jewish thought.
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing that God would use Jesus in this way to go bigger and better than the Jewish people could have ever imagined. I'm not just going to stop with building a kingdom with you. No. This is a kingdom that's going to encompass the whole world.
Right.
Watch me unify you all, despite your differences.
Yeah. This isn't just a restoration of the 12 tribes of Israel. This is a restoration of creation.
Right.
Everybody. And you see that modeled here. Again, this goes back to that conversation we've been having throughout, that Jesus didn't just say something. It seems like in Luke over and over again, it's like Jesus is modeling something, and then he has something to say about what he's modeled.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so here he is, again, we're watching the way he is living, and already just in this conversation, we're saying, man, this is what that means for us. Like, he is healing them all. All of these people are experiencing restoration in their life, and these people are not just from the 12 tribes. These are people from tribes that aren't even a part of Israel. And so in the midst of this picture, Jesus looks up at his disciples. And so we have this like transition. It's still in the same place, but there's a transition of I guess, like the focus, right? The focus is going to move away from the miracles that are taking place and into this conversation that Jesus is going to have with his disciples.
He modeled. Now he's going to teach.
He modeled. Now he's going to teach. But I do want to say really quickly before we get to what he teaches, what he speaks, don't forget, though, this mental image of what is happening in front of these disciples as Jesus is saying these words, like, right? Because it says he looking up at his disciples. So basically,
power is going out of him, healing all people from all over
that are pushing in just to try to touch him. So you have like this, I mean, I don't want to say chaos because you shouldn't necessarily associate restoration and chaos, but at the same time, like it would probably be a little chaotic. All these people pushing in and all these crowds from everywhere. I'd imagine there's a bunch of different like languages being spoken because these people are not like from the same place. And so there's just so much happening. And while there's so much happening and all this restoration is taking place, Jesus looks up to say something to his disciples.
And he says, "Blessed are you who are poor." And he says, "Blessed are you who are hungry. Blessed are you who weep." And he goes through this list of all of the blessings of these people who are not perceived as blessed while he's standing in this crowd of people who the world would perceive as unblessed.
I'd even imagine his disciples probably looking at these people, almost looking at them with pity, right?
Yes.
Like, man, could you imagine having to be that guy? Could you imagine having to be that guy? Like, they're even just kind of looking at them in this way. And Jesus is like, no. They are blessed.
And, they're experiencing a little bit of the kingdom of heaven right now. And they get to experience it now. And because of this experience, this encounter with Jesus, because of the coming of the Messiah, they're going to experience this for eternity. And because they had suffering, they'll never forget what he did.
Right. And that's I feel like this right now is even kind of maybe broadening my perspective of what Jesus was saying with these Beatitudes, but blessed. And I think, again, this image in our mind of what's happening, these people gathering around him, they are blessed because what they have gone through, what they are enduring up to this point has taken them to focus on Jesus. Mm-hmm. It has brought them to this place where I have nothing left but to throw everything at him and hope and trust that he can do something with it. They are blessed because their circumstances in life have brought them to a place to recognize already the dependence that they ought to have on Jesus. They're blessed because people who don't have those circumstances maybe don't recognize their need for dependence because they think they have it all together. But it's these people who don't have their own answer, who don't have their own ability to come to this solution or to get fixed or to experience like a normal health, a normal life. Like it's these people who have been brought to the end of themselves, and they are blessed because they see that they can't be their answer. It's only Jesus. It's only Jesus. So they are blessed because they don't have to wait to recognize their need for their dependence on Jesus.
Right.
They know it. And now they've experienced it, right? So they depend on him. They've come to him. His power has gone out to them. It has restored them. And now they go, my dependence was well placed. Mm-hmm. It was well placed. And I'm going to continue to depend on him. And this kind of takes us then into and helps, again, maybe even for me, make more sense of the woes and what Jesus is saying there, right? Woe to the rich. Woe to those who are well fed. Woe to those who laugh. Like, these are people who are experiencing the highs of life. And I'm going to be honest with you, like in our own life, when we've had a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot of money, but when we've had more money, I haven't felt like I need to depend on Jesus in that moment. Like, oh, we're okay. We've got this figured out. When everything is going well, I don't feel like I have to depend on him. I mean, not to bring any focus to me, but I've mentioned it a couple of times over the last few months now. I've been having some health issues. And, before I was having these health issues, I don't think I necessarily was depending on Jesus to get through my day. It was just a foregone conclusion that I was a healthy person and I was going to wake up and I was going to get through the day just fine. I mean, it may have its own, ups and downs in the sense of like what work might throw at me or what being a parent might throw at me.
I mean, you're working hard, right? Recognizing we need to rely on him for every situation, but you're not necessarily dependent on him for just the things that you've almost taken for granted.
100%. And I feel like because of the health issues I've been having for the last 6 months, genuinely, I wake up now and it's like, all right, Jesus, like I'm depending on you to get through this day. I'm depending on you for the energy to get through the day. I'm depending on you to sustain me through whatever pain might exist so that I can do today what I need to do today.
And so while people would look on the outside and say, man, I pity him, instead, it should be this view of, wow, the way that he is getting to experience Jesus, he is blessed.
And I can genuinely testify to that. Not the blessed statement. I mean, yes, blessed, but I really have come to realize just how dependent I am on Jesus. In this specific area, because it's the specific area that I'm dealing with right now. But genuinely, in a way, I feel like I need to say, Jesus, I'm sorry for how long I operated outside of my dependence on you for just the ability to operate on a given daily basis. Over these last 6 months, you have exposed to me just how you've exposed to me my need for dependence on you. And even though it doesn't necessarily take everything away, Lord, I know I truly am dependent on you for this moment today. And I'm going to be dependent on you when I wake up tomorrow for the energy and for the endurance and the stamina to get through tomorrow. And that's a good place to be. I am grateful in a way for the things that I have been going through because it has grown me in my dependence.
And when you consider who it is, I think that Jesus is talking to, these disciples that are surrounding him, and he's speaking this truth of blessing and truth of woe to them. And then you fast forward, right? It was not known to them at this time what all they would be required or asked to give as they took this responsibility of messenger as sent ones to the fullest obedience.
Yeah, I mean, again, in the studying of each of the individuals, many of them were martyred, and it wasn't a pretty martyrdom, right? Beyond the martyrdom conversation, even those who weren't, like I think of John, like John died of old age essentially, but in exile, in a place that wasn't his own, thrown away from everybody because of who he was focused on, who he was following, who he was pointing others to. Beyond that, I mean, Jesus even talked to them along the way about how, like, you're not going to have anywhere to lay down. Many of these, again, think of Matthew. Like, Matthew had great wealth, and yet in pursuing Jesus, he willingly surrendered that. Now, it doesn't say all of a sudden he became poor. Like, we can't necessarily make that case, but in following Jesus everywhere he went, he walked away from a home. Maybe he didn't give it away, but he was no longer staying in it.
Certainly walked away from the lavish lifestyle he could have enjoyed.
Right. And then you think of like Peter, James, and John, and them walking away from all the fish that they had just caught and that miraculous catch. Like, these men walked away from certain levels of comfort to follow Jesus,
which would ultimately lead to a continued life of
discomfort in a way.
But Jesus would sit there and he would call them blessed.
And so maybe it's important for us. This seems like maybe a little bit of a downer, but maybe it's important for us to hear the woes that Jesus speaks today. Maybe it's important for us to slow down and recognize those areas where we are maybe taking him for granted, where we are taking things for granted. Like for me, like how I have for a long time taken my health for granted. Maybe we need to slow down and take stock of those things that we are taking for granted. Because that's essentially what Jesus is calling out here in the woes. When we have the resources at our disposal, we don't have to be dependent on him. You know, when we have money, we don't have to worry about where we might be living. When we are well fed, we don't have to worry about where our next meal will come from. When we are laughing and having a good time, we don't have to worry about the worries of life that might come in. We can be dependent on Jesus in these moments. And it does. So in other words, it doesn't mean that just because we have resources, we're not dependent, but we need to be careful. Jesus is saying,
there's a warning.
There's a warning. Be careful. Remember your need for dependence. And so that's what I'm hearing today as we look at this passage. I am hearing this call to be dependent, yes, and this reminder for each of us. So like this week, maybe we need to slow down and take stock. We need to look at, are there areas in my life where I am self-sufficient, where I am self-dependent? Are there areas in my life where things are going so well that it's functioning on an autopilot and I am not slowing down enough to recognize my need for Jesus's guidance and leading in each and every single one of those areas? If so, I need to hear Jesus's woe. And we need to slow down. And so let's hear Jesus's woe and let's evaluate where we may need to slow.
As you journey with us, we recommend purchasing Midweek Meditations, A Journey Through Luke, Part 2, which is available for purchase on Amazon. Also, be sure to follow the Living Vertizano podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.